Hi and welcome to the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast for athletes, coaches and professionals who want to achieve their goals faster. I'm David Charlton and I'll be sharing proven methods from leading athletes, coaches and experts that will help you get the most from your talent. Today's show is sponsored by Functional Intelligent Training, who are a sports injury clinic located in Gosforth near Newcastle upon Tyne and specialise in athlete development, nurturing future champions, strength and conditioning support and excellent rehabilitation services. I don't know a golfer who is successful on a consistent basis who doesn't trust and have a great deal of confidence in their putting stroke. To the listener who doesn't know a great deal about golf, putting is a small element of the game. However, it is a massively important element. So in this podcast, I'm thrilled to chat with an experienced and highly esteemed putting coach, Andy Gorman. In this episode, we're going to drill down on how you can help yourself putt with trust and confidence under pressure, a massive part of mental toughness, so that your knees don't knock and you don't get in your own head and don't tremble with fear when you're standing over putts. We chatted offline about your work as a golf coach who focuses more so on the short game and putting. And you've mentioned that you have a vetting system for when you're working with players. Would you like to tell listeners a bit more about that and why it's important?
Yeah, it's something I started doing probably 5 or 6 years ago. It was really important to me that I got the right clients, not just for me, but for the client. And so we have a vetted call. Every client inquiry is met with a call, and typical inquiry will be via some kind of electronic platform, email or inquiry through a social media platform, and so we arrange a meeting, phone meeting, and it may or may not be on Zoom type call. So typically in the first instance with an international client, it will be a sort of a FaceTime type calls. We get an idea of facial expressions as much as anything else. In the UK, a little bit easier to sort of measure the client by voice, but internationally, because of colloquialisms in dialect, it's oftentimes easier to see, facial expressions and whether or not they understand. They may speak perfectly good English and maybe English speaking, Australia, America. But ultimately, what happens is, our dialect gets lost, a little bit of translation loss. And, so it's important for me to get that face-to-face contact as much as possible. We go through some questions, very simple questions. What are you looking to achieve? Why me? What do you hope that, you'll get from it? That type of thing. And then, what are your expectations in terms of putting work into this? I can deliver a program that is very efficient at getting the player out the other side quickly. And of course, it depends on where they are as to what that so the journey looks like. It could be, as little as 6 to 8 weeks. And we see in the results we're looking for, or it could be a fast track player, which is on 30 days, intense, or, we could well be, looking at a longer term process if, yips are involved. And I think that's one of the things that we need to be mindful is meet the player where they are. In the first instance, and then we go through the process of what are the mechanical issues, the psychological issues that are affecting the player performance on and off the golf course, good in practice and not on the course. Have they got transferable skill challenges? And that I can ascertain, and at that point, then I will determine whether or not that is that person is an ideal candidate, or what type of program I feel is best suited for them. Which then determines, what their level of commitment in terms of time, finances, and, training, etc., is going to be involved.
I'm guessing throughout that process as well, one of the big factors in all this is how much effort they're likely to put into it and their motivation, commitment levels.
Yeah, it's, you get a lot of players say, yeah, they want it, but actually they don't. And it's important for me, over the last 5 years, I've had very, very close to 100% commitment. And more importantly, 100% out the other side to, to see the levels of improvement. I want the player to exceed what their expectations was on the program. I don't want them to think, they're going to make a 2-shot improvement and, be happy to settle with a 1.8. If we agree on a 2-shot improvement, I'm, working, not secretly, and make no bones about it, I'm working towards seeing them on a 3 or 4-shot improvement. And, shot measurements are always a challenge because, they may be working on their putting, they're not working on their long game. They see improvements on the greens, the proximity is further away from the hole, and they naturally will have more putts. And I did this with a European Tour player a number of years ago now, and, I had to sort of almost shake him to say, look, actually, you've improved your overall scores. You've hit less greens, which was a really important thing, that you hit 16 to 17 greens in regulation, but your proximity was about 45, 50 feet and had a number of 3 putts. We've eliminated the 3 putts. And ultimately, that's, great, but you've missed a few greens now because you're prepared to do that, because actually proximity was more important. And, you now have a different number of putts on the green, but actually hitting it closer to the target as well. And it was, I was working specifically on putting, but, we identified a challenge was actually in proximity. So, they're all challenges because they're different numbers, and client expectation then. And, he was happy once he realized that actually the whole game was improving, not just the putts were improving, but his proximity, he was missing more greens. So, there's different levels because, 20 handicap golf was a different expectation to, to a tour player, of course.
And then obviously you've got the time factor as well into that, haven't you? People working full-time jobs and how much time they can actually put into it.
Yeah, it is. And, I'm not asking a player, any recreational golfer, to spend more than an hour a week. I know because, it's now proven over the program. So I've been rolling out over the last 5, 6 years that we've got, absolutely no issues with regards to a relatively short period of time. An hour a week, 2 half-hour, 3 20-minute. However, the 1 hour, one session, 1 hour, that doesn't work. You've got to repeat the process a number of times. But, sort of the 15, 20, half an hour programs, practice programs are going to see results and going to see them very quickly. It's just the way the program has managed to roll itself out. And of course, if you want to put more time into it, then the results are exponential. So it works nicely.
You talk about their practice programs. What are the key elements of these programs that you put in place?
Critical one for me, ultimately what we're looking for is start line. Start line's a real critical process. Speed, of course, determines what line you're going to choose out on the golf course. But if a player can't start the ball on the line they intended, then, we have got a challenge. And I've said it to a number of coaches in the past. I've worked closely with aim point coaches, and, if a player can't start the ball online, there's almost no point in understanding how to read the green. That's not to belittle aim point, or any other green reading process, because ultimately you've got to determine what line you want to hit it on. And speed is conducive to that. So, it is often, a combination. It's always a combination. But to start with, when a client comes face to face and I've got Putt Lab data, we look at the differentiation between club face and path, and then what the golf ball's doing in relation to that. And then we try, to determine that during the process of learning, we're going to improve the error between club face and path, which will ultimately straighten the start line. But it may be a completely different process to what we've seen in the past. We may see a player aiming to the right, swinging across it, pathing to the left, and, they've got to learn how the aim versus the resulting ball line, start line process is going to, affect things on the course. I then, if I see it's really bad, then I'll oftentimes watch them hit a few shots on the course as well. We'll go out onto the course and, sort of with a more elite player, just watch them play before we make any commitments going forward to any changes. It's like, well, what are we looking at on the course? If they are a right aimer with a slight over the top pull into hitting the golf ball, then, that may be something we have to accept, that this is the process, that this is where this player is. So you have to meet a player where they are, as much as, apply what I would, call an anatomical principle change so that the body and the club move more efficiently.
In terms of putting, obviously, there you've talked about in effect, the technical elements around improving someone's putting. When it comes down to the pre-shot routine, which I suppose is something I'm probably more interested in at the moment, what would you say are the other key ingredients?
I like to keep it simple, and I say to folk, look, if you can find a different way of doing what I want you to do, then that's fine, providing you tick the boxes. For me, whether you use a line on the ball or not, the ball has a relationship to the target. It doesn't have a relationship to the target until it's landed on the green. So, once a ball has become one with the green, then, a line on the ball, even if it is just to understand your start line capabilities or your pureness of strike, I want to see a start line process. So we line the ball to the target, wherever that aim is, but ball to target, putter to ball. We want the face to be in the player's neutral zone. So if they are, let's just assume, make it a lot easier, it's 0. So everything is perfectly square. Ball to target, putter to ball, body to putter, in that order. And so that the feet are not planted before the club goes in behind the ball. I let the posture that we have built in the process of change, or that the player brings, if it's adequate, and we just see that it's a basic aim issue, wherever it is, we'll let the putter position behind the ball dictate where the body goes. I don't want a player stepping into a ball, setting his feet, and then the relationship of the ball and the target line haven't been established. So, that's why I like to see ball to target, putter to ball, body to putter.
Do you find some players can get stuck, I suppose, on the internal side of things, where they're not looking at the target enough, where they're not, they're not target focused enough?
Yeah, it's kind of, so there are a number of players that are like that. And when you point it out to them, the amount of times that you actually, it's like plainly obvious to me and not to the player. And when you point it out to them, they still don't get it. So that's a really critical part of the overcoming of the challenge, it's the joy of coaching, how you get a player to see, to identify, to feel, and you're probably then tapping into all the senses, because, they may not be that visual individual. I'm a visual, visual, kinesthetic, auditory, in that order, and that's me. And not everybody's like that. And, to get to understand how a player is, sometimes you do have to have them standing in front, or you have to go through, some questions that just give you a better understanding of where a player is. The use of words will do that, of course.
I like that way you mentioned there about the senses and the visual, kinesthetic and auditory. So supposing I'm a visual learner, how would you build that into that pre-shot routine?
From that point of view, I'm trying to identify that as well during the initial call, which is why it's important for us to sometimes have that visual. But I'll oftentimes, when we don't do that, because it is just a call without any face to face recognition, the words, then, I'm trying to I might be a little bit ambiguous in a statement that I'm saying, but I'll ask, do you hear what I'm saying versus do you see what I mean? And, then that oftentimes triggers a response, which then I can say, right, okay, this is, that kind of player. Or if I see a player, and again, they're all different, and you have to respond accordingly. There is no definitive. I wish there was. I've yet to find it. But it's when you see a player whose focus is on visual, but their aim is off, you have to dig in really deep. That for me is like, how can you be a visual individual when you can't see that you're aiming poorly? But that can oftentimes be just down to postural challenges that they've gotten used to seeing what they think is straight. And, so it's one of the anomalies of coaching there is no definitive. I wouldn't say there's a definitive answer, certainly from my perspective, that a player can ultimately then, be taught in one particular way, because you may have to dip into the secondary process in order to be able to trigger their primary learning process. It's the joy. It's the bit that, it's that challenge of the coaching. I don't always like the easy ride. I like to hear that a player is determined first and foremost to put into action and give me the rough ride as the coach to be able to get them out the other side, and identify maybe why we are struggling. Oftentimes I find that a player who struggles to gain good visual awareness of target is struggling with balance to start with. And that becomes a huge challenge, from my point, is then, how do you deliver that message across? And the balance would be subtle. They're not about to fall over. They're just subtly out of balance. And that's affecting their primary processing and maybe even their secondary processing.
That makes sense again as well, because if your balance is out of sync, potentially in your posture, then your eye line could well be, 2 or 3 1 or 2 inches either side, and it's it's a difficult one to. I mean,
I've seen coaches working the process before, sort of setting balls down on lines, but again, that I don't think that's definitive, but it helps, So you'll find a way to get a player to see that they're out of sync, and to get them almost to blindly line up. That's another thing as well relative to the target. Right, there's the target, screen them, right? So, sort of screen their visual perspective of the target and get them to feel the target. And it's amazing how many of them can feel, I'm visual, but, that means that I can also see when I'm not aiming in the right place, but I'm actually using my sensory perceptions to, my balance, my feel through my feet, to actually determine, this is not going to finish where I want it to, which is the bottom of the hole. It's going to finish left or right of the hole. And, that I've got a couple of tricks that, I show players, where they're at and why they can actually tell me where they feel it's going to finish relative to the hole. But now it's to get them to trip over themselves and go like, well, why can't you make that adjustment on the course or make the adjustment now? And actually, interestingly, that's where players sometimes without a line on the ball can get into a better setup position from a certain range. Certainly on the longer putts, they get themselves squarer to the target because they think they're seeing what they're seeing, but they're not. And when they get down over the ball, if you put a line on the ball, they tell me that the ball's aiming to the left or to the right. Invariably, it's left, which is a peculiar one, of course. But, and they're under-reading the amount of break that's in there. So it's great to be able to show players that, that they can free aim, far better, because then they're rather than relying on their eyes, which they're thinking they should be doing, they're relying on their feel that's coming through the ground.
So in terms of feel, how is it that you actually go about improving the feel aspect for a player?
Again, come back to the visualization of where they feel the breaks are coming from. I'm fortunate that in the studio I've got a Zen green stage, so the platform that you'll see on Sky Sports, that puts a player into 2, 3, 4% slopes over, sort of up to 15 feet of putt. And that gives, a very good representation of what feel, is happening in the ground through their feet. And, obviously a lot of the time we talk about feel as distance control, but for me, the big deal is that distance control improves massively when we optimize posture. So when a player is struggling with poor posture, and for me, that's a huge deal, Is the putter the right fit? Does it allow the optimum posture so that we are perfectly in balance? We're within our base, i.e. shoulders are not in front of the toes. So there are no sort of imbalances thrown in through the brain into the body that's then affecting how the putting stroke works. Then for me, a player becomes immediately, I can see immediately, they tell me that their distance improves, distance control, speed control improves over the longer range putts. So we're working on that level, from the get-go. Feel is something that kind of kicks in, but then obviously in training, we're looking at distance controls. So I have a few distance control drills, which I put into a player. Again, one club length progressively back away from the hole. That gives feel, but at the same time, there's a penalty for always a penalty for coming up short. And then we set distance parameters behind the holes. We're looking at all the time targeting optimum speed for getting the ball into the hole. Break points, they're obviously getting out onto the green, whether we're outdoors, during the season, or we're working in the studio on the green stage. How a player then determines where their blind feel is. It's the term I use, is a blind feel. Where do you feel you should be aiming? And when a player tells me that, they should be aiming, when they're they're just relying on the one sense, visual, they're telling me that this putt's, about a hole from the right, and actually then you set the ball, rolling down a perfect putter or, some other rolling tool, and get them to see the ball start on a line that's possibly 12 inches away, and then what happens to them in terms of feel, typically under read, we overhit, to try and repair the break deficit. You can then start to build that in. So a player then starts to identify what their slopes, green reading factors they've got to get into, understand how much green reading is important. And it's amazing how many good players don't know how to read greens. I mean, it is one of my biggest challenges of all, is how does a player play to the level they do when they can't read a green?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I notice, like, when I'm working with players, how when it comes to like trying to visualize slopes and the ball traveling towards the hole, how some players just can't do it. They just see straight lines, and yet other players will see breaks, absolutely no problem at all. Yeah,
it's and you see the confidence of a player who's locked in. That's the beauty. I mean, I love that when a player just gets locked in, bang, hits the ball, hits the back of the hole, drops in. Difference between match play and stroke play. A player runs the ball at the hole because it's got to go in. We see that with Westwood and Poulter, two really good examples of players who, in the match play environment, we know what the postman can do. But Westwood puts better in match play. He's very tentative at his putting when it comes to stroke play, especially, and becomes even more so in championships versus tournaments. But it's almost as when the consequence of the return putt becomes less, the putt becomes more aggressive.
So how would you get over that one because again, a common theme I see with players is if they're standing over a birdie putt from sort of 8 to 15 foot, where they half expect themselves to make it, where they again become tentative, leave it short, and obviously get frustrated from there. How do you get over that?
I find the changes that I've implemented over the years with posture has improved the speed control on the putt, because we use the bigger muscles. We use the main structure of the body now, far more readily than, a posture that's more bent over. Typical coaching is more eyes much closer to the ball line and more over the ball, even if it's just inside the ball, than I would employ. And the first thing is that, gaining good posture, athletic posture, allows the lumbar spine to be able to allow the core, the upper core of the body to be able to make rotation through the ball. The problem that a player suffers with is when they're relying on their hands. Now, coaching says that we don't want to rely on our hands. I think we're pretty close to 100% across the board. The golf industry doesn't want players using their hands as their sole sort of feel mechanism. But in practice, that's not the case. It doesn't work like that. In practice, what's happening is the bent over posture limits the body movement and actually puts more emphasis and reliance on the hands, which then tends to freeze up because of speed factors. The backstroke's either too short or can be too long. We have decelerations, we have rapid accelerations, but we have very limited control without doing 2 to 3 hours of practice every day, which of course the tour player can do. Recreational golfer can't do. The tour player relies upon it, but you watch a tour player when they're practicing, they're bent over, they're stretching, they're stretching the back, flexing out. That's suggesting posture's not good. And then, they get over putts that we all feel they should make, and they're tentative. And that just shows the emphasis and reliance that they have upon their hands, for feel. It should be a marker towards them. For me, I don't think that it is sufficient to marker. And that's, where do they go to get, what I'm suggesting? And ultimately, when most folk are still requiring the body to be a little bit more bent and flexed over, the emphasis on hands and speed control through hands is a significant one. You look at guys like Tiger, who's always stood up tall, allowed his arms to hang more from the shoulders, has had great feel and control on long distance putts and has knocked his fair share of putts in what we would call the scoring zone of less than 15 feet anyway. And he's aggressive. But I feel that it looks like he's aggressive on the basis that, one, he doesn't worry about the ones coming back because he does generally knock most of them in. And then, even as he's gotten older, he's still had that tenacity and capability of being able to knock those shorter putts in, those must-make putts. But, he's, for me, always had the ball running at an aggressive speed, at the hole because posture allows him to do that. So that kind of, maybe not the answer that you're quite expecting, but it comes down to posture improves, feel and speed control and the use of the bigger muscles in the body.
Yeah, posture is certainly a big part of that, no doubt about it. In terms of the mentality and the focus, could there be too much onus on the target or on the hole? How do you change that?
I mean, ultimately, I think if we're outcome driven, I want a player to get to the point where they don't have to feel like they're totally reliant on their, on this putt going in. There's an expectation, but it's almost intuitive. I want a player to become intuitive, and so that they're not thinking about it, and they're not worried about the consequence. Because if the ball happens to miss because of a mitigating circumstance, whether it's a spike mark or whatever, they're going to knock the one coming back in. So the more they become focused on the task at hand, become conscious of the task is holding the putt. And, I find that the guys that can get into that mindset, I'm going to hold this putt. And it doesn't matter how I'm going to hold it. I'm going to hold it. The hole is always going to be part of the target. What I don't want a player to be overly conscious of is how they're doing it. But that's where the practice comes in. They become competent and they become confident in their competence. They know they can start the ball online. They know they can be aggressive if they want to be, and they're going to narrow their, focal point of that target down to, to the width of a ball versus the width of the hole at dead speed. I want a player to feel like they can practice, and the emphasis in that coaching is that we're going to put the ball at least a foot past the hole. And that then helps us to determine the speed we're going to be hitting the ball at. So again, it comes down to, I don't think you can get just one particular point. It is a collaboration of all of the speed, the hole, the start line directions, all of those factors, and like to see a player, and again, if a player can do it, some players can't visualize the ball going into the hole. They just can't do it. They can't visualize the flighted shot. I don't know how to do that. If they can't do that, they can't do it. But where do you want it to finish? Right. And if that becomes where do you want it to finish, then that places the emphasis on the ball going into a certain point across the cup. When it falls into the hole, where do you want to see it falling in? And then they find it a little bit more visual, in terms of, if you can't visualize how the ball's going to get there, let's visualize the point that you want to see the ball roll over. And then they can focus on that. That just becomes their single point of aim then.
Yeah. What you were saying there as well was by practicing the right things, the key elements there, then they're going to build up that trust so they don't really need to worry too much about the hole, the target. They're just going to go about their business and try and put a good stroke on.
Yeah, and I think, you see a player, on a hole, we see that countless times a player comes down with trouble on the left, out of bounds on the right-hand side, and they go and knock it into one of those troubles. They put a provisional ball down and just smack it down the middle cut in the fairway and go like, well, why didn't you do that first time? It's because there's a different mindset standing on that second shot. That's, or second swing, third shot, obviously. But, it's and understanding why a player doesn't do that, that can be a challenge, and it's finding where the player's at. A few juniors that do the same thing, bogey the first 4 holes and then shoot level par for the next 14. And you go like, so what are we going to do to get you to the 4th tee? Or what happens on the 4th tee? Trying to identify with a player what happens. How do you get a player off to a quick start and keep them going? And that's the same on the putting green as it is on the numbers on the scorecard at the end of it. The game within a game is, sort of hopefully 1 putt every green and 2 if you must.
One thing as well, we've talked a lot there about consequences. The player with the yips, I'd imagine, is seriously worried about consequences and the return putts. How do you support that player best? Again, by when it comes down to it, there's a few things actually. I use a terminology called the cone of error, and I show them that a putt over a meter length, that they can make some error and the ball still goes in. So we put 2 sticks down the side of the hole, we draw them back into a cone shape and position the golf ball just in between the sticks at the very end of the cone and the narrowest point. That works out approximately 3 degrees of error either side of the center line of the hole. And so what I'm doing there is giving a player an understanding that from 3 feet, they can actually make a bit of error. In fact, they can make 3 degrees of error either side of the start line, 6 degrees from one side of the hole to the other. And, we've just read the data on a 10-foot putt on Putt Lab that may be saying, actually, you only make 1 degree of error at 10 feet, or, even 2 degrees of error at 10 feet. You're still within the realms of, making every putt inside 3 feet. Again, assume that you've got to read the putt and start it on the right half of the hole if there is some break, but actually to give them an understanding that there's a bit of a cushion at 3 feet, which is generally where those short putts are missed. And again, understand that the lack of speed or the lack of momentum is more critical than the lack of speed. The lack of speed because we don't need to hit it very far, but also the lack of momentum in the stroke is poor strike. Errors are more accentuated, and the effects of the conditions of the ground may also expose the error on the putt. So, when I talk to folk, you've got to be make enough backswing, but control the speed. And if you're trying to control the speed with your hands, then you're going to have much less control of the club face, which determines where the golf ball goes. We then go, once a player understands what is the cause of the error, of whether it's the yips or it's poor aim or perspective, then they're much more able to work through the process. And, there's multiple stages of the yips. I don't mind sharing the fact that, in 1993, I was struggling with the yips, and that was painful for me when I first, struggled with them, I couldn't tell you which side of the hole I was going to miss from 4 feet, let alone, how many putts I was going to have. I mean, I know I was more likely to miss it than hold it. For 4 feet, we're talking about this cone of error. It's like, how did that happen? My dad was caddying for me during those times, and he said, I can't watch this anymore, and actually stopped caddying for me, which was, one of those shames within my, sort of playing career. But, it was physical issues that were causing the problems, and the manifestation of the misses caused the psychological problems. When you stand over a putt expecting to miss, you've got to get into a very different mindset. And the only way you're going to change the mindset is to become positive of the outcome. Whether you miss the putt or not, did you produce a decent enough strike, an effective roll?
ineffective start line, or speed. So, once you can then start to, it comes down to, can we purify the strike enough that we can predict the start line? And then we can become more predictive on the speed, so the optimum start line relative to the target. And, the outcomes then, that process now, I have over 95% success rate on Yip Cure. It's the challenges that I've had with Yip Cures is the inability for a player to accept as a cure. And they may well have been struggling a long time, but I've had players who've struggled with it for over 10 years. And, they gravitate towards me because, they understand that I've been through it. And I wasn't standing over there, not able to draw the putter away from the ball. I think that's probably its most extreme, when you can't pull the putter away. However means you're going to make by taking the putter away from the ball, I think that is when it gets to its most extreme. And I've seen some really horrific, impressions of that. And, that's tough to deal with, both because I feel the pain of the player. I've been having missed my share of putts. It first hit me 33 greens in regulation in one day in a 36-hole tournament and 10 3-putts inside 10 feet. The pain of that was actually I finished second by one shot and shot one over par. At the rate, I hold a few putts as well during that day, because I hold a few putts that were just outside of that, and I was literally knocking sticks out. It was the best tee to green game I have ever played, and I couldn't even get it under par. But I hope that your listeners and yourself will trust my stats now. But I have not missed a putt on the golf course inside 6 feet for 5 years. So at the rate that I convert putts at now, I would have probably won that tournament by about 14 or 15 shots and shot a record, sort of ridiculously low record. I mean, I had that many birdie opportunities, given the ones that I converted anyway. And it wasn't a case of, there's 4 par 5s and I hit them all in 2 twice, and 3 putted them all. That was not the case at all. It was, there was a couple of par 4s I knocked it on. There's only 1 par 5 on the course. So, there were a lot of challenges that day. And it took me a while. It took me nearly a decade to overcome them.
Yeah, I've noticed it's horrible, isn't it? When people just get that sinking feeling before they even go out.
And the short game specialist as well, I see it there. So putting and short game, I see it. And so, that it's going to manifest in short game, because the pressure to get inside the comfortable zone length that a player is in, which is typically within a foot, now puts a ridiculously high expectation on short game that even the best players in the world can't achieve. So, it manifests right the way through the game. Once the putter is afflicted, the rest of the game is so significantly damaged, or pressurized. I'm not saying damaged to the point where they can't play, but pressurized. It oftentimes, with an elite player, can knock them out in no time at all. And, but there are cures. A player doesn't have to suffer for very long.
Yeah, and that's the key. And from this podcast, there is a cure for the yips, no doubt about it. I would say technically and certainly psychologically. So as we begin to wrap up there now, who would you say has been the biggest influence on your career?
Oh, wow. That's a question. There's a curveball. It's easy to look around and look at folk and go like, what, influences, the obvious ones, you look at the better players. For me, I was looking, I grew up in the era of, Nicholas was at the end of his career. Obviously, Seve. For me, I was very fortunate. I've always, apart from 5-year stint in the Caribbean, I've always lived 5 minutes from the Belfry. I'm still at now, a little bit more than 5 minutes, but not much. And, so whenever there was a tournament there, I would literally just camp out. So as a kid, my dad would drop me off on his way to work at 6:15 in the morning, and then he'd pick me up on the way back. In fact, sometimes he used to drive past and then come back for me after he'd had something to eat. And I just used to, wherever Seve was camped, that was it. I would camp down. I was very fortunate to have some dialect with him. I was very fortunate also that during the Ryder Cup of 85 and 89, I was working there. So I kept that rapport going on a little bit more, but I was always inside the ropes. As a kid, he was very embracive of juniors. as long as we didn't interfere with what he was doing. But he would oftentimes just sort of like, look, see, and sort of explain then what he was doing, but, not using words. I had to be able to visualize what he was telling me, and that release of the hands and that sort of how he would caress that ball with any club. I mean, getting balls out of bunkers with 3 irons with a 6-foot lip on them was, how do you do that? And then I'd spend hours and hours practicing that, and then likewise with putting, obviously Langer was having his troubles. Jacqueline was having his troubles. And I was very observant, but I could always see that these little sort of bent over postures and twitchy hand, fast muscle responses was something that we didn't want to do. And, the book said you always use the body. And then, of course, Jack Nicklaus has bent over it double. And then it was looking at Crenshaw, Trevino, Faxon, and watch what these guys did and why that they were recognized as silky smooth putters and what was it that they did. And then, sort of identifying really from there. And of course, towards the end of the century was the, Tiger came on board, and that's where the visualization for me of everything, that's how it works. That's where it comes from. But I didn't have the answers totally for me. I had to dig in real deep. And, it comes back to my dad again. He just said, look, you don't have to do everything by the book. You'd have to do everything that works. So if the book has to be torn up, be prepared to tear it up and throw it away. So, quite a few influences. Yeah. Seve, I would say primarily as the primary golfer for me. And then obviously secondary was Tiger. A lot of folk weren't even born when, Seve was going out and about, a lot of people go, well, how good was he? Some kids don't even understand the work ethic that Hogan had. And of course, I couldn't not say Hogan either. So it is, quite a breadth of influence really, but, Hogan never sorted the putting out to the level that he did with ball striking. Not saying he wasn't a good putter because he knocked his share in, but, it was a different way of playing back then, especially on the greens.
You've certainly mentioned a lot of big names there. Yes, I go back to Seve days, certainly towards the end of his career. And yeah, he was fantastic to watch. But importantly, you mentioned your dad as well, which is it's a nice thing. So from the conversation, then what 3 takeaways would you give to the listeners?
I think the important thing to understand is that putting, we need to use the body the way it's designed to move if we're going to be efficient at putting. We then need to become, to try and become instinctive is to recognize then what is your body, natural requirements of your body. And you'll find that putters need to be longer rather than shorter. You need to stand up more into a position where you feel like you're more athletic, and that actually you can cure putting ailments, challenges, and severity of the yips in a fairly straightforward way. There was always a variable time frame. If the yips was the cancer of golf, then, the common cold of not feeling great, standing over a couple of putts and missing a few, happens to us all, and a common cold might be a couple of days and the cancer might be a few months, and a few years even. But it's, in that scale of challenge, there is a cure. You may be required to put in some work yourself. But now, certainly, over the last 5 years, I'm comfortable enough to pin my colours on the mast and say that in all coaching that I do with the right clients are prepared to work at it, I guarantee the result 100% every single time.
Excellent. I like to finish on a positive note there.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Whereabouts can the listeners find you, Andy?
The easiest way to find me through social media channels at Andy Gorman Golf, and my website is andygormangolf.com. If you'd like to message me, you can also, there's some freebies on there as well. So if you join the newsletter, you get a copy of the 10 myths of putting, as well as the newsletter that comes out on a regular basis. And, if you've got any inquiries, then you can check in the inquiry form on there.
That's brilliant. I've really enjoyed the conversation. You've shared some fantastic tips there for the listeners. So, yeah, big thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me on, David. It's been great.
It was great to get a fresh perspective on helping golfers improve their confidence on the putting green. And over the 30 plus years of playing the game to a decent level, I've been around some excellent coaches and players. So it was great to hear that a different approach. The psychologist in me likes to simplify putting, telling players that I work with to keep it simple, very simple, to not get carried away with the outcome, to not focus too much on the target once they're ready to go and stroke the putt, simply trusting their putting stroke. So as I say, it was nice to get a different perspective, perhaps a more technical perspective of how a top coach like Andy helps golfers on the greens. And while we're talking about developing your putting confidence, you might want to look out for a blog that I published last week called Putting with Confidence from Today. It's got some great advice and great tips in there. Also keep your eyes and ears open for a podcast in the near future when I do an episode specific to being aggressive and building trust on the greens. See you soon. I'd like to give a big thanks to today's sponsors, Functional Intelligent Training, who are a sports injury clinic located in Gosforth, near Newcastle upon Tyne, and specialise in athlete development, nurturing future champions, strength and conditioning support, and excellent rehabilitation services. Thank you for listening to Demystifying Mental Toughness today. To sign up for tips and advice to help you be the best that you can be, go to www.sport-excellence.co.uk and sign up to the Mental Edge newsletter.